Okay, so let's face it, none of us can escape the fact there is an election happening. But as property investors, a lot can happen after an election. So this week, we're going to review all the manifestos from all the main parties and give you our thoughts.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. Yes, we are only a week away from the election. Good news, that means it'll be over soon. But also, if you haven't made your mind up about who you're going to vote for yet, maybe you'll be swung by what the parties have to say on housing. So we'll be running through all of that and then sending you away uplifted. Nothing to do with the election, but because of Hub Extra. So it's 1 week to the election. Yeah, bet you're excited. How are we going to cope when it's all over? Well, luckily, we'll have Christmas to see us through. But while the country as a whole is a bit fed up with politics in general, I think, this election is an important one when it comes to housing. Because in the past couple of elections that we've covered on the podcast, we've been struggling for much to say when it comes to the housing policy of different parties. Yes, they're all throwing out different big numbers, seeing who can compete to say they'll build the most houses, but we know they're not actually going to do it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. This time round, there are a lot of differences in the different parties' housing policies, and there are noticeably far more of them. Housing, and the private rented sector in particular, has become far more of a political issue over the last couple of years, and that's reflected in the parties' manifestos. So as an investor, what do the policies of the different parties mean to you? If you're deciding who to vote for purely on the basis of housing, which box should you be putting your cross in? Well, we've read the manifestos, so you don't have to. Okay, that's a lie. We've got someone on our team to do it. But someone's read the manifestos, and we're going to talk about it today and help you decide whose policies you like the sound of.
Okay, so let's start with the Tories, the Conservatives. They are normally the party that is associated with being the most landlord-friendly. However, over the last few years, they've not really demonstrated that. They've introduced more aggressive taxes, whether it's the stamp duty or not recognising mortgage costs as an actual cost, even though in any other business it would be, and so on. They've not really been landlord-friendly. In fact, it would not be considered a stretch to say they've been a bit anti-landlord, a bit anti-investor. So, based on that, what have they got in store for us this time? Well, stamp duty is back on the agenda. But if you're in the UK, fear not, because this additional 3% in stamp duty is for non-UK buyers, so people overseas. So if there's someone overseas, a foreign national, who's buying a property in Manchester, London or Birmingham, they will pay an additional 3% in stamp duty. Now, of course, we don't have any more detail than that. This is a manifesto. But if you're not a foreign national, then you're probably okay with this one because it doesn't really affect you. And actually, it levels the playing field because a lot of those people will own properties in their own home, buy a second property in the UK, and not have to pay that addition if it's their first property in the UK. So that allows them currently to get around it. But this will stop that. So one that will raise a bit more revenue for the government and one that won't disappoint too many people.
The most eye-catching policy in the Conservative manifesto is actually one that's already been announced earlier this year, which is banning the use of Section 21, which is the no-fault eviction procedure. The short version of what this means is that if you want to get rid of a tenant and the tenant doesn't want to go, you have to go through the courts and prove that they've done something wrong, rather than just waiting for the fixed term to end and then getting them out far more quickly. This was a real shocker when they announced that they were looking into this earlier in the year, because it was actually a Labour policy where, if you're being cynical, the Conservatives saw that this was proving popular, were worried that this was going to lose them some votes, and so quickly announced that they were going to do it themselves. Technically, at the moment, this is something that they're only consulting on, but as we all know, when parties decide that they're going to do something, they generally do it anyway. But what they have said consistently, and to be fair, this has been in all the documents released since, they are planning to balance this out by strengthening the other grounds for eviction, so it's still possible to ask a tenant to leave if you want to sell the property or move back in yourself. And they're also talking about reforming the legal system so it doesn't take the ridiculous amount of time it does now to actually get an eviction process through court. Another tenant-related policy that's in this manifesto is a really interesting one. It's the idea of lifetime rental deposits. In other words, as a tenant, rather than having to find a whole new deposit for the property you want to move into before you get your previous one released back to you, you could effectively passport it across, which actually actually seems like a really good idea because there are lots of costs associated with moving. And in terms of cash flow, having to find a whole new deposit, even if it's only 5 weeks, before you get your last one back is really hard for a lot of people. I've seen some people saying this is unworkable, and clearly there are reasons why it would be difficult, but the idea seems like it would solve a very real problem. So it'll be interesting if the Conservatives do get in to see what happens with that one.
Something else they're promising to do is continue to reform leaseholds. So leaseholds have got a lot of press over the last few years, if you read the property press like we do, and they have been reformed in a positive light. The majority of things that they have done around leaseholds have been positive. So there's very little said here in the manifesto, but the fact that they've acknowledged it and they're going to continue to do more of it can only be seen as a good thing. Now, the general taxation rates that we all pay obviously have a big impact on us as property investors. So it's worth acknowledging the general tax changes there. When it comes to corporation tax, income tax, national insurance and VAT, Tories have promised no raises. So nothing will be increasing there. And actually with national insurance, they're going to raise the threshold to £9,500 per annum, and they're going to push that up to £12,500 per annum eventually, although it's going to take some time to do that. So as far as your tax is concerned, there'll be nothing additional to pay there. However, I will throw this caveat out. Generally, the policies there announced by the Conservative government are okay for property investors, and some are favourable, and some are favourable for tenants without really hurting property investors. So on the whole, not too bad at all. However, previous manifestos from the Conservative government have been absolutely fine when it comes to property investors. It's what they did when they got in power afterwards that hurt us. Just because it's not in the manifesto doesn't rule them out doing something negative for the investor-landlord community. But the great thing about Labour is they're going to tell you how they're going to hurt you. They've been very good and told us up front exactly all the pain that they'd like to bring.
Yeah, how long have we got to go through the Labour proposals? There's so much. Let's start with the most eye-catching one, though, which is rent controls. So they plan to cap any rent increases in line with inflation. And they also plan to give each city its own rent controlling powers. So if a particular city decides that there's a problem with rising rents and they want to impose a tougher cap, then they can do that. Now, spoiler, rent controls are going to come up in the manifestos of all the rest of the parties that we're going to talk about, not just Labour. So can we take a sidebar here, Rob, and talk about rent controls? I've got lots of problems with rent controls in general. You can point to loads of historical examples where it hasn't worked and has actually made things worse. But the thing that gets me is, why are rent controls being talked about now when rents are actually falling in real terms?
It makes absolutely no sense. And you could say, well, actually, they have been above inflation in the past. And you're right, they have. But this is what happens with rent. At some periods of time, it's above inflation, and some periods of time, it's below inflation. But overall, it pretty much follows in line with inflation over time. Rents aren't like property prices, and they don't always go up. It's consistent, and if you look at the historical graphs, rent increases have been consistent for many, many years. This policy sounds eye-catching and maybe a vote winner, but it really isn't needed. And it's possibly suggested, Rob, that it's needed, to stop landlords being, aggressive with tenants, and then they can wheel some tenants out who will get upset about their rent going up at some point. But here's the thing. Landlords don't really set rent levels. If that was the case, then people would be charging £1 million a week. They can't because no one will pay it. The market sets rent levels, not landlords. The market is in control. You can have whatever number you want. You're not going to get it unless the market says that is the fair value of a property in this area. It's not landlords that set rents. This is just a bizarre policy. And as you say, Rob, it's not just with Labour, it's across the board. Bonkers.
And you can see abundant evidence of this. So landlords' taxes went up and everyone said, that they'll just pass that on to tenants. Didn't. Rents didn't go up. The fees ban came in, so you couldn't charge fees to tenants. Everyone said, they'll just go into the rent instead. Didn't. Rents didn't go up. So clearly landlords did not have pricing power. And against a backdrop of falling rents, this seems like a really weird time for everyone to get obsessed with this. But hey, it's in there, maybe just because it sounds good and will win some votes. Who knows? There's also in there the notion of open-ended tenancies and the abolition of Section 21, which is the same as the Conservatives' proposal because it was actually Labour's to start with. And they also plan to raise taxes on holiday homes in the form of a levy and also a 200% increase on council tax. for holiday homes as well.
Something that seems quite positive is that they want to have tougher sanctions for property investors that break minimum standard rules. And they're mooting the idea of a property MOT, which would be a legal requirement for all landlords to complete an annual inspection of their properties. I think that's actually a good thing, and I think that's a fair thing, and any good landlord probably wouldn't have an issue with that. Something they might have an issue with is Labour also want to fund a new renters' union to allow tenants to defend their rights. Not really sure what rights they haven't got after the Labour government, so I don't really know why they need a union, and I'll keep my thoughts on unions to myself, but that one just seems a bit of a nonsense.
And among the many things that are in the Labour manifesto around housing, there are a couple of notable absences. One of those is a progressive property tax, which they mooted back in the summer, where it was effectively going to be a variant of a land value tax, and it was going to be paid by the landlord instead of the tenant. That was talked about, but it's not in there. And another policy that didn't make the cut was one that was also floated earlier in the year, which is where tenants were going to be allowed to buy properties from their landlord at a discount. So effectively, right to buy, but for private tenants. This is one we talked about when it was announced because it sounded bonkers. Then when John McDonnell was questioned about it closer to the election, he said, oh, actually, it doesn't apply to everyone. It only applies to the richest landlords, whatever that means. And then when it came to the manifesto, wasn't in there at all. So one of those things that sounds like a really good soundbite, but they decided later, maybe not such a good idea. Although, same caveat as the Conservatives, just because it's not in the manifesto doesn't mean it can't happen.
So taxes for the Labour Party. Corporation tax is going to increase up to 26%. That's up from 19% currently. They have no plans to touch VAT or income tax for those who earn under £80,000. But for those who earn over £80,000, there will be increases. So some property investors could be affected by the changes there.
Okay, we made it through. If you're still with us, then let's talk about the Lib Dem manifesto, which thankfully is lighter when it comes to housing. They are also talking about longer tenancies. They're saying they'd promote longer tenancies of 3 years or more with inflation-linked annual rent increases built in. That doesn't say that they'd enforce it. Maybe it would be encouraged somehow, or shorter tenancies would be discouraged. Who knows? But that's something that's on their agenda. As is licensing. They've said they will improve protections against rogue landlords through mandatory licensing. So, as we talked about on the podcast a few weeks ago, in lots of parts of the country, there is already local level selective licensing. Maybe they're talking about bringing in national licensing in England, like you've currently got in Scotland and Wales. Or maybe they mean they get every local authority to do their own local version of licensing. As ever, it's a manifesto, so details are light, but that's what they want to do.
Something that certainly can be considered positive for all involved is a help to rent scheme. So to introduce a government-backed tenancy deposit loans for all first-time renters under 30. For people moving into big cities for the first time, the amount of deposit they would need to raise to rent that property is quite substantial. And the cost of moving for any young person is expensive without taking into consideration this deposit. So I think this is a really positive step that would be welcomed by all sides. Something that I think will be generally welcomed by most people is an increase in minimum energy efficient standards of the private rental sector. It's something that we have already, but it would just be that they're going to raise the bar further. That will ultimately mean better homes for people who live in them, and it's of course better for the environment. Yes, there will be some costs involved, but overall I don't think we can grumble too much about that one.
You might want to grumble if you're a second home owner though, because they want to give local authorities the power to increase council tax by up to 500% where homes are being bought as second homes. And they're also talking about a stamp duty surcharge for overseas buyers who are buying second homes as well. And you might want a bit of a moan if you own a company, because they're talking about putting up corporation tax only by 1% though, so it would go up to 20% from its current 19%.
The final party we're going to talk about is the Green Party. They also want to introduce rent controls, which we've talked about, which they say will reflect average local income rates and the cost of maintenance. We await to see the details there. They have very high standards of what they want to achieve for all homes in terms of energy efficiency, and they want to ensure that all 8 million rented homes are A-rated for energy efficiency, or as close to this as possible, by 2030. Again, raising standards can be seen as a good thing. That is a very, very high benchmark. The little get out there of as close as possible is probably needed. But I don't think that will come as a shock to anybody voting for the Green Party, that they're looking to improve the standards of rental homes to have a positive impact on the environment. So no surprises there. But Rob, there are some other general housing policies that they want to introduce as well, though.
Yes, they're also going to be ending no-fault evictions. So that's a clean sweep. Whichever party comes to power, it looks like that's going to be happening. And also there's a big thing in the Green Party manifesto about ending the so-called hostile environment policy for immigration, which would include getting rid of the right to rent scheme. I'm kind of surprised they're the only party to mention right to rent specifically, because it seems to have been an absolute mess ever since it came in. And there's evidence that it's actually increasing discrimination against the people who are already having the toughest time. So I think it could be considered good news all round if that one went away.
So I think it's worth saying now that there are other parties we could have discussed, but we've talked about all the parties that are standing nationally. We don't have time to give a voice to all the parties, but a lot of these policies, and we've even seen this in just focusing on these 4 parties, are shared across many of them. So with that in mind, Rob, overall, generally, what's your thoughts on housing and this election? Is it a good election for housing and investors and landlords, a bad one, or somewhere in between?
As I said at the start, there's a lot more about housing than there normally is, and a lot of consensus. It seems like the needs of private renters has become far more of an issue in recent years. And so you're seeing even the Conservative Party, who wouldn't normally be interested in that kind of thing, being pushed into doing things like strengthening eviction laws. And you're also seeing things like rent control being talked about by at least a couple of the parties, which would have seemed at one point like quite an extreme proposal, but now it's pretty mainstream. So we gave the caveat earlier that just because something's not in a manifesto doesn't mean it won't happen. And of course, as everyone knows, if something is in a manifesto, that's certainly no guarantee that it will happen. So listening through, you'll be able to hear that some parties broadly are more positive than others from a property investor's point of view. But if public opinion is going a certain direction, they will change policy. So while there are probably some parties as an investor you'd rather have in power more than others from a purely investing point of view, there are no guarantees at all. And I don't think this is very helpful to anyone, but hey, it's our podcast, so if we want to have a bit of a moan and event, we can do. But it's hard to feel positive about any of this, isn't it?
It is. Not just the housing manifestos, but just the general manifestos overall. There's a real opportunity here, and I feel like it's been missed. I mean, I know Labour have got some wild and some people may think wonderful ideas, but no one else has really gone, okay, let's do something that isn't going to wreck the country, but also can really take us forward. Like a really ambitious manifesto. It's probably the least inspired I've been by an election since I've been an adult. I just think it's really disappointing. And it does feel this time around like voting for the least worst, which is a bit rubbish, really, to feel like that. How do you feel about the election, Rob?
Similar, and it's difficult not to feel coloured by the last few years of what we've witnessed in politics as well. I've never felt less like voting than I do this time around. But if you're looking for some kind of positive in the whole thing, you can at least say that there's an actual choice to be made this time. The kind of things that Labour are proposing, not just across housing, but across the board, is very different from what you get from the Conservatives. It's been common to complain in the past about there not being that much to choose between the major parties, and at least that's not true this time round. The Conservatives very much seem to be playing not to lose, though. The manifesto is very light, and it seems like they're very aware that they're in the lead going into this, so they're just trying not to announce anything at all if they can help it that might put some people off. So the sum total of that is, well, okay, there are some positives you can find if you look hard enough, but yeah, it's pretty uninspiring across the board. But hey, at least we've got Christmas to look forward to afterwards.
We have, and there's nothing like a bit of mulled wine and a mince pie to cheer you up.
Well, let's not wait for that. Let's cheer ourselves up right now by sharing a fantastic resource in the form of Hub Extra. This is the bit of the show where we give you that little bit more, a book, a tool, a resource, a podcast, something to improve your life a little bit. And you'll also have your life improved by the Hub Extra email that lands in your inbox every Friday morning. And Rob, you've put forward this week's Hub Extra and you've got a book for us, I believe.
I have. I nearly didn't pick this up because when I read the reviews, it was very mixed. People either seem to really love it or people kind of liked it but took a lot of offence that there was a lot of religious talk weaved throughout the book. And the author, yes, he is a Christian, and yes, he does talk about Christianity. But whether you are pro-religion or anti-religion, I really just don't understand why you can't enjoy this book for what it is, and it is a great story of Walt Disney. The book is called How to Be Like Walt, Capturing the Disney Magic Every Day of Your Life, and the book is by Pat Williams, and it is a great, uplifting book. It tells the story of Walt Disney, and it's a fantastic story, and there are not enough books out there for me that do tell the story of Walt Disney. It's my favourite business, the Disney business. I think it's an incredible business. What they have done and what they are doing is just inspiring. There's so much to love about Disney and what they do and how they make people feel. And this book does a great job of taking you through Walt Disney's journey. And he's a true visionary. What he did, what he achieved. Yes, he's created the Disney brand that we know and love, but actually he did so much more, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't just he created a mouse and suddenly it was a roaring success. It had so many ups and downs, but there's so many beautiful stories in his journey. There's a whole chapter dedicated to Mary Poppins, and that is an incredible story. Most people won't know, but that took 18 years to put together. I won't spoil it and tell you why now. If you listen to the book, you will find out why. So if you do get put off by people talking about religion, then just skip the bits towards the end and just be tolerant throughout. But if you're open to that, and more importantly, open to a wonderful story about an inspiring individual, then do pick it up. It really lifted me and at times moved me. I found it an incredible story. I personally connected with it, and really from the business side of things that we do gave me a lot of inspiration. So a wonderful book, a really uplifting book, and just what we need after today's podcast, Rob.
Well, I just got an email this morning about having a new Audible credit, so it sounds like that's where it'll be going. Looking forward to checking that one out. So that's us done for this week. We're going to be back next week on election day itself, but we're not going to be talking about the election. We're going to be talking about our resources of the year. It's one of our favourites to put together. Always loads of great books, podcasts, TV and everything else being shared. So make sure you don't miss that one. And after the election result is out, we will record a quick podcast with our thoughts and summing up what it might mean for you as an investor. So lots to look forward to. We'll see you for that very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.